Welcome to episode 88 of the Steady On podcast, Spouse in the House, with me, Angie Bauman, and my guests today, Cynthia Ruchti and Becky Melby, co-hosts of the new book, Spouse in the House. I have worked from home most of my married life, and as the needs of our family have changed, the way that I work and the number of hours I work have changed, but flexibility in and accessibility to my work has been something my husband Matt and I have prioritized. And when COVID hit and so many of us who had been working out of the house needed to find ways to keep working from home, I actually felt relieved that Matt was one of 3 or 4 people in his department that continued to work on site. It's not because I don't like him or I didn't want him around. It was because my kids were now schooling from home. I was trying to juggle keeping up with my work while the kids' needs were changing and very fluid. And quite honestly, from a practical standpoint, I didn't know where we would have physically set up a workspace for him in our home without an even greater shrinkage of the space I'd grown to declare mine. Those are the kinds of things that Cynthia and Becky addressed in their new book, Spouse in the House. What happens to our marriage when a lot of hours we were used to spending apart now become hours we spend together? How do we deal with more spatial togetherness? My verse for this episode came from Becky, and so I encourage you to listen for it in the interview. It's Philippians 2:4, which reminds us not to look to our own interests, but each of us to look to the interests of others. If you have ever or think you might ever have a change in your marriage that involves more time at home together, I think you'll appreciate the honesty these ladies bring. Let's listen in. Hello, Steady On community, and welcome to this Stronger Together conversation. I'm Angie Bauman, and I am joined it's tonight when we're recording, with 2 guests. I have co-authors with us today. Becky Melby and Cynthia Ruchti have written a new book called Spouse in the House, Rearranging Our Attitudes to Make Room for Each Other. And I'm so excited to dive into this. Thank you, ladies, for joining me today and spending a little time with us.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
Cynthia is an award-winning author, a literary agent, a speaker, a radio host who lives in Wisconsin and is on the worship team at her church. True or false? Is that true?
That is true. The radio broadcast did retire in 2012, but I spent 33 years in that ministry.
So then you just wear that hat forever, I think.
I think I should.
I think so too. I've been a pastor for almost 20 years now, like 18 years now. And I laugh because I'm like, I think no matter what happens, you might be able to take the girl out of the church, but you won't take the church out of the girl, right? Yeah, that's
so true.
So, and so what do you do on your worship team? Sing, play an instrument, several things?
I do both. I'm not the world's best keyboard person, but every once in a while they put me on keys and challenge me, which is great. Otherwise, I'm a backup singer. I call myself the senior citizen backup singer on the teeny bopper worship team.
I think it's perfect.
It's really a joy.
I bet really you're good for them and they're good for you. I bet both are true. So.
I know they're good for me. That's for sure.
And Becky is a writer and a speaker and a Bible study leader who, true or false, loves camping and riding motorcycles.
Well, the riding on the back of a motorcycle.
And who drives you? Is this your husband? Do you do this together?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. But you do love camping?
Yes. Yeah. We have a camper. We have a camping group of retirees, and we thoroughly enjoy that.
Do you write while you camp? Or is that you do? Yes.
No, sometimes I have to if I'm on a deadline.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, ladies, when I saw this book title, I will say my mind went immediately to a few years from now when my husband retires. And I thought about how that season is coming. But upon just a little closer investigation, I realized that that's not the only time that a couple's circumstances can change to create more spatial togetherness, if we can put it that way. So who is this book for? Who might benefit? And I'm going to put this question to Cynthia first, and then Becky, fill in some blanks, maybe even, or add some things to it when Cynthia's done. But who is this for?
I think initially we might have thought that it was for people who were coming into retirement age, even though there were circumstances in my own life where my husband was forced into early retirement at 50. So it wasn't a traditional, you turn 65 or 70 and then retire. And that's when that kind of instantly hits you. But But also, soon after we started writing it, we realized, boy, I wish I had heard this when I was a newlywed. I wish I'd considered some of these things when I was new in my marriage. And even at the midpoint of our married years. But we also, and I'll let Becky list some more, but we also think of military spouses where there's a spouse in the house, real tight quarters for periods of time, and then they're gone out of touch for a long time, or over the road truckers, and this day and age, there are far more people who are running home businesses from home, all kinds of things like that. And Becky, I'm sure, has a few more to add to that list too.
Yeah. Before I do that, it was interesting because when COVID shut down so many things, my husband was one on a team of maybe 3 people that stayed in the office the whole time. But my kids had come home. They were both schooling at home. I always work from home. And so we had all this spatial togetherness. And it's really interesting that you say that, because there were several times that I actually was grateful that he didn't also come home, because and it's not because I don't get along with them or didn't want him at home, but I'm like, man, how would him trying to work full time from home, the kids trying to do, like, that's a lot when I've spent years at least having part of most days like on my own in the house, and I think, so yeah, I think a lot of people are going through some kind of change in their home spatial routine. Yeah. Becky, tag into this, and who else comes to mind for you?
Well, I have 4 sons, and 3 of them have their own businesses. So they are able to set their own hours. A couple of them are working from home. One is home because of disability. And we do have a chapter on that. That's one of those unplanned, unexpected, unwanted situations where you may find yourself juggling a home career while you're caregiving. So that's another place that we've addressed.
Yeah, I had an aunt whose husband, what you said, over the road truck drivers. I think you said that, Cynthia. And the family laughed for years about how the fact that my uncle was gone all week for so many years is what saved their marriage. It was kind of like one of those things. But it was interesting because when he did retire, it was such an adjustment, because not only was it like the days, that he was gone, but it was really the week, like he was gone, for a lot of times over the week. And it is a really big adjustment. And so I'm just wondering, like, what are the things that change in us? And I'm sure, there's so many different situations and they are unique, but I'll start with Becky this time. Like, what are some of the major things in a relationship that changes when you're used to having time apart, but then you find yourself living together in a lot different way?
I think a lot of it is just deciding who does what when. You talked about, if your husband came home, where would his office be? If you're both doing Zoom calls at the same time, if you're going into retirement, you might have one spouse who's been home for a while. The other one leaves, the work environment and comes home. Then everything changes with who does the jobs, who does the chores, whose turn is it to clean the toilet, who empties the dishwasher. Do you divide things into indoor and outdoor? What are you going to do with your free time? Time to spend with each other, having fun, but then we also need time with friends to be on our own. So all of those who, what, when, where kind of questions you need to talk about.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cynthia.
I have a thought too to share in regard to that is kind of an interesting thing, that when I was raising our kids, I was a stay-at-home mom, but I also worked from home. So I was doing double duty, as many of us do. And I remember longing for the day when there would be quiet in the house, when there wouldn't be a lot of chatter. There wouldn't be somebody always tugging on my sleeve or my hem, or asking for things of me, and that I would have time to think thoughts through, that I would have that space. And the older I get, the more I appreciate true quiet. All this time I've been doing all the work that I do around and amidst a lot of other things and a lot of noise. Then I began to so appreciate the ability to have a peace hemmed atmosphere. If there were going to be any noise in the house, whether that was music or something else on in the background, that would have been my choice. And then all of a sudden, when a spouse comes home, oftentimes the noise level changes. They're not making racket necessarily, but their thoughts maybe come out verbally that would have been an internal thought for me. Or there's a television show on in the middle of the workday. How does that even happen? And some of those things are logistical. Some of them are attitude. Some of them are just the presence of someone in the home at the same time too. That's an adjustment that if we kind of ignore the challenge of that instead of addressing it and doing proactive things about it, then it can start to be an irritation instead of a change.
Yeah. And I think I'm guessing, not really guessing this, I think this is an educated guess. You ladies tell me what you think. I think whatever might have been a frustration before is then like accentuated and it rises to the surface, right? Because something you can sort of deal with or push when it's more temporary, and then you know that you get a reprieve from it or whatever, all of a sudden now it's like more sort of in your face all the time. And you're like, hey, this is kind of a problem that maybe we haven't addressed as much as maybe we should have or needed to. And now it's kind of risen to the surface. Is that what you found as you've thought about this book and who it's for?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I found little things that I was used to doing, like while I was cooking and nobody else was home, I'd leave cupboard doors open. And then my husband's there and he's banging his head into those cupboard doors. And, it wasn't anything I was doing deliberately. Wasn't trying to offend him, but it became annoying. Little things that he does.
It didn't bother anyone before.
No, it
Right.
wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
But I'll sit down to read and all of a sudden he's listening to a video, and I have one great tip is the chunky little earplugs that look like little yellow barrels. Those are marriage savers. When we camp, we're in a 260 square feet camping for weeks at a time sometimes. And earplugs, earphones, headphones, it expands your living space.
Yeah.
Becky said something really interesting the other day on social media. She had a picture of a couples group that they were camping with. And her comment was something to the effect, and Becky, you can correct me if I get it completely wrong, but something like, you'd better enjoy the people you're camping with if it's raining all day and you're reduced to sitting under the awning, elbow to elbow during that time. And it was kind of this visual picture for me of, yep, that's it. Anything that might have been a slight irritation, if you head out the door and you're leaving for work all day long, that irritation doesn't have to be addressed again until you come home at the end of the day. But if the irritations kind of live in the atmosphere around you, because that's where you're spending a lot of time, whether it's because you're forced to be at home together or that's a conscious choice, those irritations are kind of like, well, do you enjoy huddling under that awning with 10 other people that you're elbow to elbow with? And so I think naturally, it's just natural that irritations will be exacerbated if the space is small, if the walls feel like they're closing in, even if they aren't. And oftentimes we use that expression too, if you're breathing the same air and all of a sudden it feels like there's not enough oxygen for both of you.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's very true, because it does, again, it just accentuates it, like magnifies, condenses, I don't know, something that's already there, but it raises it to the surface and asks it to be dealt with. So I want to ask you ladies, when you've experienced this change in your marriage, this spouse in the house, you've talked about just a couple of things that maybe were challenging. Is there anything else that was challenging that comes to mind? But also, were there things that you learned to appreciate? Maybe even not right away, but with a little bit of time. Either one of you. I'll go to Becky first.
Oh, there were so many things I learned to appreciate after I got over
the original. Like, how long did the shock take to wear off? Maybe, like, approximately. Do you know what I mean? Like, what? Because how long a season was that before you began to appreciate things?
This may not sound encouraging.
No, I think I think truth is encouraging. Yeah.
My husband started out with semi-retirement, so you would think that would ease us into it, but I would say the process took about 2 years.
Okay. No,
until now I can say, 95% of the time, I just
You're
thoroughly
glad.
enjoy.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to have somebody to bounce ideas off of.
Mhm.
We brainstorm together, and Cynthia and her husband do the same thing. It's just nice to have another person around.
Yeah.
And we have figured out how to have our own spaces and our own time. But yeah, so don't get discouraged if it, if you start working, trying to put systems into place and attitudes in place, and it doesn't happen right away, you gotta give yourself grace.
And I hear you saying that just because it feels wrong, maybe for a little while, like it feels different or wrong, doesn't mean the whole thing is wrong, right? This is an
Right.
adjustment. I mean, I think about even just like when my husband and I were married almost 6 years before our first child was born. What an adjustment that was, not just to have a child to take care of, but what it did to us as a couple was such a huge, and it felt wrong sometimes. It felt unsettling, and like I couldn't get my feet under me, and there was just a lot. And I remember that as I listened to you talk, I remember that. And our oldest son, the one I was just talking about, is a senior in high school this year, and I think when he leaves in a few months, I think that'll be a different again. And so I think maybe it's good also to remember, for those of us who have been married for a while, things change, and
Sure.
and then they settle in again. Yeah. What about you, Cynthia? Maybe some things that were particularly challenging, and or some things you've learned to really appreciate?
I think one of the things for us that was, even though we're talking about the idea that sometimes those little irritations can be magnified when in this kind of a situation, I think there are also differences that then become magnified in this situation. So I'm an indoor person. He's an outdoor person. I have this drive within me that loves the work I've been given to do. And I love to stay active at that. And I used to think that there was no such word as retirement, and that word was very precious to my husband. So part of it in our adjustment was realizing how he wanted to spend his retirement. And my years of while he's retired right now, I have the wonderful privilege of working from home, but I still have work and responsibilities, and in some ways have just come into this certain season that I'm enjoying in the various responsibilities that I have too, that I don't want to set them aside and recreate all day, every day. That's not within me. So I think one of those adjustments was, at the very least, I had to learn how to respect that his way was not wrong. It was different from mine. And he had to come to respect the fact that my way wasn't wrong, but it was different from his. And then find ways to find that beautiful word compromise of how are we going to work that out then? How are we going to actually work out our schedules so that will make a difference?
Hey friend, I'm cutting in right here to ask you a question. What message does your heart long to hear? I wouldn't have been able to answer that question before I became a student of the Enneagram, but now I understand as an Enneagram Type 1 that what I most want to be able to believe about myself is that I'm good. And by studying and applying the promises of God, I can know that I am good because I'm His creation, and God looks upon His creation and calls it good. Genesis 1. A fabulous group of ministry friends of different Enneagram numbers from the Red House Writers Collective have joined me for the Steady On Ennea Longings podcast miniseries. The miniseries includes episodes on strengths, stresses, and core longings of each Enneagram number, along with biblical truth that speaks to the messages our hearts long to hear. The miniseries also features bonus episodes on typing and mistyping and addressing concerns some Christians have about using the Enneagram. Many of the guests have even included their own ministry freebies in the downloadable PDF workbook. You can grab all of these goodies filled with powerhouse voices by clicking the link in today's show notes. Thank you for listening. Now, back to our show. I think that there could be resentment there on both sides. Why doesn't he support my work? Because I'm still working. And I think on his side, it could be, why doesn't she ever play with me? Because I'm done work, So yeah, I think that's so important to have those conversations. Otherwise, I think we make assumptions or make up stories, or we just don't talk about things that actually they can be compromised on. Yeah.
We even had to figure out how our learning styles are different.
Sure.
At the time when we were apart during most of the day and just together for the evenings, let's say, and the weekends, that wasn't as big of an issue. We probably should have addressed it before, but now that we're spending more time together, even understanding how our learning styles, our communication styles are different, not necessarily opposite one another and not necessarily opposing one another, but together between the two of us, we make one pretty decent person.
Yeah.
If you put his gifts and his skills and mesh them with mine, and that's what we're leaning on now. And rediscovering humor. That was another part of it too.
Oh, and I know from just the introduction that Becky and her husband camp and ride motorcycles together. So I know that they have found some things like that too. Maybe they always have, maybe you always have, Becky. I don't, but that's something that they enjoy doing together. What about you and your husband? What have you found either that you've always done that you've kept doing, or something new that you found in this season that you really appreciate and doing together?
Bill and I have always had times when we used to do it specifically in the fall, a short getaway from the house. And one would think when you're retired and you're together all the time, that's not necessarily needed anymore. Wrong. It's still needed partly because you need to get away from the normal responsibility location, which is home. Mm-hmm. So we just got back not long ago from a road trip to go to a special apple orchard. And that's become kind of a routine for us every fall to go do that. We know where we're going to eat at a little bit fancier restaurant than we typically do in the middle of the day after we've gotten our apples. We know where we'll stop. We know the scenic spots, all that sort of thing. It's again become a routine, but it's one of those things that we both enjoy and are making memories. We have to keep making memories that cannot stop.
Yes.
Even if you're together 24/7.
Yeah.
Special times as opposed to just being with one another.
Yeah. Becky, as you look back on retirement or other seasons, are there some conversations that you think would have been helpful to have had earlier, or conversations that you had maybe during that difficult, those first couple of years that were pivotal in terms of moving you forward?
I think talking about hopes and dreams and bucket lists, because those things change. Maybe the last time you had time to talk about those things, you were in your 20s before kids and careers just took over your lives. And now if you're home together, working from home or retired, you've got that time. And it's sort of a need to rediscover this person that you've been with for possibly decades. So asking some of the questions that maybe you were asking when you were dating. We've talked a lot about one of the motivations for writing the book was that we go to premarital counseling before we enter into this union. And then decades later, it could be a whole different kind of situation because we've changed. Not only has our situation changed, we've grown, hopefully, and our interests, our desires have all changed. So kind of going back to those questions, what do you want to do in your life? What kind of adventures do you want to have? What do you hope to accomplish? And then asking always, how can I help? That idea of putting your spouse's needs and wants ahead of yours changes the atmosphere.
Cynthia, I want to ask you this question, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but as Becky was talking, I was thinking about the woman who's perhaps dealing with a husband that isn't adjusting very well to retirement. Like you said, like maybe from a disability. I know I have a good friend right now whose husband got laid off during COVID. And so they're in a season where he's home all the time and they don't know what's next for them. Or maybe some men and women, I don't want to put they did retire on purpose. They got to that point, but then they realized so much of their identity was wrapped up in their job. Right. And so I think it's not an easy thing sometimes for the one who's coming home either. So I don't know. Do you have some thoughts, encouragement? What kind of conversations are important around that?
That was an interesting thing in our situation too, because Becky and I No, we are not marriage experts. That's not why we wrote the book. We've just had a lot of experience being married. And the imperfections.
Sometimes just surviving it makes us an expert.
Yeah. But the fact that there have been times when, for both of us, and I'll just speak for myself right now, but times when I did it well and a whole lot of times when I did not do it well. But one of the things that I was caught short on, that I was caught up on this and had to make a shift, an actual attitude shift, was realizing that in any change, and in my husband's case, that was certainly true. There were times when the job that he had, like the one in where he was forced into early retirement, that felt like a deep loss to him.
Yes.
It sounded like, great, I can hunt and fish and golf anytime I want to, but it deep inside, where even he hadn't realized, it felt like a loss. And then there was another job that he had taken as a part-time job for a while. That job was eliminated when they made some shifts within the organization. That felt to him as if he'd been fired. And it wasn't a firing. It was that the position was eliminated with restructuring. So my understanding, there are a lot of things that are happening in his mind or in his heart, some of which he's aware of, some of which he's not, that are actual wounds. Yeah. And if I'm not conscious of the fact that any change is going to come with accompanying things that are like that, it might have been that something that he experienced in this era that he's supposed to be enjoying, in this time period that he's supposed to be enjoying, reflects on something that was something that was not looked upon respectfully in his childhood or in his circle of friends. And so there's so much where I had to step back and say, okay, I know what I need during this season of life, or maybe I need to think a little harder about what it is I need. But if I'm not conscious of what is it that he needs spiritually, emotionally, and many times I realized I can be a healing influence in this, or I can be an irritant and make this harder on him. Yeah. I can let resentment take over, or bitterness, or even the idea of, hey, I'm still working here, or that sounds like an interruption to me because you have the time. I don't have the time right now. But if I stop and realize what's at work underneath the surface, possibly, and then have those conversations about those kinds of things as well. Yeah. How does retirement make you feel? How does our being home together all the time, perhaps because of a pandemic, or perhaps because we're working from home, how does that make you feel? Or where are the places where I can make this load easier for you, as well as expecting or wanting or longing for him to make the challenges for me easier for me? Yeah. Shifting my focus from me to shift my focus for what is his heart's need, and how can I help meet that heart need?
Yeah. When you're talking, I'm thinking about just the difference between approaching a conversation, or even like Becky was saying, her husband's like irritation about banging his head on the cabinet sort of thing, but approaching that from actually he's hurting deeper in this, right? There's a loss, there's even grief. I think sometimes it's like with retirement, there can be a wrestling with our own mortality or our purpose of like what am I good at now? I don't know what I'm worth now. I think that would be hard for a lot of people, and to approach those situations with, he's hurting, or he's even scared because he doesn't know right now. And I'm scared because this used to be one way and now it's this way. And this, for me anyway, I think that my husband's such a rock for me, and when he's wobbly, I'm like, oh wait, the whole world is wobbly when and all of that can create fear and anxiety in us too. And to approach it like that, instead of you're just trying to be annoying or trying to take over my space, but really, I just hear you guys saying we need a lot of extra grace for each other when we go through something like this. Yeah. Yeah. Becky, I'm wondering, is there a scripture verse or passage or story in the Bible, either with Cynthia, or on your own that's been really important to you, either as you've walked through this season, as you've written this book? Is there something that comes to mind that's been something you've held on to and it's guided you?
I have
you
little
do.
cards.
I love it.
We need these on our mirrors, on our refrigerators.
Put them everywhere.
Yes, definitely. Philippians 2:4, let each of you look not only to the interest, your own interest, excuse me, but also to the interest of others. We think of that so often. We need to do this for our neighbors. We need to go out into our community, but, looking at our marriage as ministry. Yes. And, outdo one another in showing love. Those verses like that.
Looking
really
at our
changed.
Marriage as ministry. That's very convicting to me right now. Yes. Thank you. I want you to say that again. Looking at our marriage as ministry. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there was a time in my life where, it was not a big deal. I honestly can't remember what was going on, but I was on a 3-hour car ride and just sort of whining to the Lord and, getting teary-eyed because my marriage wasn't perfect. It wasn't bad. It just, my husband wasn't meeting all my needs. And I felt the Lord just kind of whisper and say, can you love him for me?
Yeah.
And that changed that whole perspective. Okay, this isn't all about, him making me happy. I have a role. And when your husband comes home, whether to work at home or, after, like my husband left a 35-year career, he's a chiropractor. He owned his own business, had his own practice. He had people coming in every day saying, I feel so much better, all because of you. And then he comes home. He wanted to be home, but that's all gone. People are calling him Bill. They're not calling him doctor. And I realized, one of the things I needed to do was continue to thank him for the work that he had put in all those years to support us and provide for us. And then remember just the little things that he's doing every single day, even if it's mowing the lawn, something he's always done, just say, the lawn looks really nice. I really appreciate that. And because they need their love tanks filled up just like we do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's so good. Thank you. What about you, Cynthia? A verse or passage that's been important to you as you've written this or thought about it?
Interesting, because I was going to use the very same
verse. One. I love that. No, that's great.
But on the other hand, there are a couple of verses earlier than that.
Yeah.
And this was part of the life lesson for me, is that the Bible has so much to say about this that doesn't have the word husband and wife in the verse. It's verses that are talking about just living the way Jesus would, living a grace-filled life, living a forgiving life. And so the beginning of that chapter of Philippians 2 says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, and I'm underlining all these words, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Don't do anything out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. So I started really needing to intentionally look at the Bible as my manual for how I was going to get through these years and these changes. And it wasn't necessarily those verses that are specifically talking to wives or husbands. It's the whole entirety of what God has to say in his word, watching for how does love, joy, peace, patience, long-suffering, how does that apply in my relationship with my husband? And instead of resisting the things that might have felt hard, instead embracing them and then finding how wonderful it is that, what do you know? God was right. If we're applying his principles, things do change in a positive way. We sometimes have talked about the idea that we couldn't have written this book probably 5 years ago. I know I couldn't have written it maybe even 2 years ago because I still had so much to learn. Well, 2 years ago, we did write the book, but because it takes that long to get out in public.
2 years before that. Yeah. Right.
2 years before that.
Yeah.
That there was a lot that had to change in me in adjusting my attitudes before we could seriously and authentically write about it. And we had to see that victory happening in our marriages. we had good marriages, but there were those times when we were letting our selfish desires win. And so as we then began to apply what we knew to be true, but just needed to see it in a new light, we watched things happening that have brought this peaceful, if yet still imperfect, relationship between a man and a woman.
I love that, peaceful, even in the imperfection, right? Because I can so identify with what Becky was saying, because it's so easy for me to look at what's not in my marriage, or in any of my other relationships too. Like you were saying, Cynthia, it's not just marriage, but what's not, instead of like the abundance of what is, and which is also very, very worth looking at, focusing on. Yeah. I think this has been so encouraging, and I really appreciate the work that you all have put into this to encourage those of us who will have this change of season for a variety of reasons. Before I let you go, I'm going to start with Becky, if that's okay. Is there anything at all right now that you are listening to, watching, reading, that's just bringing you joy and keeping you connected to God right now? I love to share resources with the listeners.
One of the things that I just recently bought a book that's just questions to ask your spouse. Mm-hmm. So we keep it in our van. So when we're driving, I'll leaf through and find something not too threatening, but just questions about, what do you think about this, or a memory. And, and sometimes there are deeper questions about, what's God doing in your life right now, but it's allowed us to stay connected, and it's easy to be off in your own worlds. And this has kind of brought us together. So that's been really helpful. Another thing, I just read a book was, it was called Women Who Risk. It was about women in Muslim countries, and to read about these are women who came to Christ in spite of all of the opposition that they faced, and so often they were in abusive marriages because they were property, and what they were willing to risk just to help spread the gospel, and to, and a couple of them, won their husbands over just with their quiet spirit. And I thought, I have dealt with nothing like that. So it was just, when I picked it up, it wasn't to be a marriage book, but that's what it turned out being, that it was like, I have so much to be grateful for.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those. How about you, Cynthia? Anything you're reading or listening to right now you would share?
Music is always one of the top things on my list. And I wish I could remember the actual title, but my daughter and I were together when we sat in a worship service that was in my brother's church. We were visiting. And when the chorus of that particular song came, and I'll have to look that up sometime too, but when the chorus came, I thought, this is such a pure and perfect and simple response, which is about the way that God had changed things. And all I did was worship. Yeah. All I did was bow down.
Yes.
All I did was stand still and watching God work in that. But I'm also reading a book called Gentle and Lowly. This wonderful author has written about the concept that when Jesus was talking about himself, trying to describe himself to others, he specifically called himself gentle and lowly. We have all kinds of pictures and imagining of that life of Jesus lived on earth for us, and of all the words for him to choose to describe himself, and for all the words for us to emulate then as well. What a wonderful thing to apply, whether we're dealing with our children, our neighbors, our family, our church family, or our husbands, those who live in our household, is to have that gentle and lowly attitude. And that doesn't mean low like dirt.
I know. That's what I feel, this strength as you keep saying those words, like it's gentle and so strong. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So true. So that those two things have really been rolling around in my mind a lot lately and keeping me focused.
Yeah.
The other thing is my good friend Becky, because she serves for me she serves for me in that role of redirecting my heart back to truth, of she will listen to me as a good friend does, but she will always make sure that when I end my conversation with her, I walk away with my heart uplifted, with new ideas, with my attitude readjusted and turned back where it really belongs.
I love that. I love that. And I know you're both a fan of each other's fiction work. I think you said this at the beginning, but Cynthia and Becky also have a variety of fiction reads. And so for our listeners that like fiction books, I highly recommend looking into their other work as well. I really appreciate the intentionality to which you are working to honor your marriages. That's what I feel tonight as we're talking, that you are working to honor your husband. You're working to honor your marriages, and you're encouraging us to do that as well. And so for that, I'm extremely grateful this evening. And I know that this has been an encouraging conversation to those who are listening to it. So thank you again so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angie.
And thank you for listening, friend. Until next time, peace. A huge appreciative shout out to Cynthia Ruchti and Becky Melby for spending some time with us today. Their words created space for the Holy Spirit to gently convict me of some of my own selfishness, and it's given me some things to pray on for sure. Philippians 2:4, again, this time in the Amplified Bible, do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Next week, I'll be welcoming journalist, educator, and podcaster Yvette Walker to the show to talk about how we can search for joy in all seasons of life. If you'd like to support the ministry of Steady On, there are 3 things you can do, and they're all free. First, you can subscribe to the podcast. That helps a ton. Second, you can rate and review this podcast because that helps other people find us. And lastly, you can subscribe to my weekly newsletter by visiting the website livesteadyon.com and clicking the orange newsletter button at the top. The link for that is in today's show notes. I always welcome comments and feedback. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime by emailing steadyonpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. I pray wherever your day takes you, you are walking in the confident knowledge that you are a beloved, cherished child of God. Peace.